While people are tearing down statues, and you have people like that watching and not caring, you have people like Tim Barton who are building up our national heritage with everything they got going on at wallbuilders.com. I'm so grateful for you, Tim. Thanks for being here, brother.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me with you today.
Why does it matter? Why does our history matter? Why do the things you have at your museum matter? Who cares? People want to get rid of them, they want to get rid of them. They don't want to learn about Thomas Jefferson. Who cares? What's the big deal?
Well, first of all, I would argue the reason that by and large we're seeing people want to tear down statues and remove history on some level today is because we really have forgotten the story. We don't know history. We don't know who we are and where we came from, and therefore we think America is uniquely evil. As we hear negative things about America, we don't have the context to know world history, to recognize that America wasn't doing something uniquely evil. America was participating in the same kinds of evil as the rest of the world did. But America was the first one to take steps to actually remedy and step away from some of those evil things. For example, the founding fathers, when you go back to the Declaration, the things they espoused, our philosophy upon which this nation was built, they said that they knew there was a divine creator who had given rights to man. And government's primary role was to protect our God-given rights. Nowhere else in the world were people having this notion that we were created equal. Under the king, there wasn't equality. You had lords and nobles, and then there were serfs and peasants. And we said, no, in America, we believe that there is one God, and God is the God of all man, and we're all equal in God's sight. And then in the midst of that, they recognize that we have rights, and the government doesn't give us rights. God gave us rights, but the role of the government is to protect those rights. Nowhere else had those kind of values been espoused in a governing document. America is the first place to take any kind of step toward this notion of equality and God-given rights, and even the proper role of government. The founding fathers should be praised, not for being perfect men, but for taking steps at a time when nobody else was going this direction. The founding fathers took steps that advanced liberty and equality and ultimately helped America become one of the most successful nations in the history of the world.
We're going to talk about slavery in the next segment, but show me what you have here to prove that our founding fathers took those steps.
So if you go back to Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson died in 1826. His grandson wanted to collect his writings in 1828. They were coming out with a volume of writings, and the grandson found the original draft of the Declaration. So they decided in those original volumes that they were going to produce with Jefferson's writings, they wanted to put a copy of the original draft of the Declaration in Jefferson's own handwriting. So we actually have one of those original printings of the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. And what's significant, it was 4 pages, but on the 3rd page, the longest grievance that Jefferson identified, when he said, we want to separate from the king, the longest grievance he goes through was about how in the colonies, they had actually passed laws trying to end the slave trade and trying to free slaves on some level, and the king had vetoed all those laws. And Jefferson actually goes through and he says that the king has enslaved, and in this point, he highlights enslaved these men. And the word men is fully capitalized, capital M, capital E, capital N. The only other thing fully capitalized in the entire document is the title, United States of America. Jefferson was identifying the humanity of the slaves that the king was bringing across in the slave trade, and identified the colonies that tried to pass laws to end the slave trade. The king struck down all those laws. There's a letter from Benjamin Franklin in 1773. He was writing to a pastor where he said the general disposition of Americans is to actually end slavery and to end the slave trade, but the king keeps striking down all of our laws. Well, in 1774, the king struck down the laws of 4 colonies who had passed laws against the slave trade, against slavery. And it was at this point, people, even like Benjamin Franklin, said, this is one more reason we should separate from the king. He won't even let us end the slave trade or the slave industry in our own colonies. The vast majority of the founding fathers actually came out against slavery and against the slave trade. Today, most people don't recognize or identify that, but for us, we spend time in original documents. If you go back and study original documents and writings of the founding fathers, what you will discover is in their own writings, the vast majority of the founding fathers came out unequivocally and strongly against slavery. Many of them freed their own slaves, and many of the founding fathers actually never had slaves and fought against slavery their entire life. But today we're being lied to about the foundations of America, about the history even of our founding fathers. And that's why we see these movements to cancel them, because we no longer know who they were or what they believed.
Amazing. So how do you juxtapose this or justify Thomas Jefferson writing all those things, putting men in capital letters, really emphasizing that these are indeed men and not property, and he himself owning slaves? How do you make sense of that?
That's a great question. It's a logical question. So one of the things that is worth noting is Jefferson actually did do many anti-slavery laws, promoting them as a legislator, as governor, as a congressman, and he as president actually did sign the very first law in the history of the world banning the slave trade. He signed that law on March 2nd, 1807. So Jefferson took significant anti-slavery movements. But when people say, yes, but he had all these slaves, it's true. When Jefferson got married, Jefferson's wife had a lot of debt from her family. It actually was several $1 million worth of debt. And the laws of Virginia actually specified that you could not free slaves if you had any personal debt, because slaves could be collateral. That was number one. Number two, they said if you do free any of your slaves, which you couldn't do if you had debt, but if you did free your slaves, you had to give them enough money that they could sustain themselves and they wouldn't be a burden on society. And then if they didn't find a home and have an industry to themselves, they had to get out of the state of Virginia so that they weren't a burden on the state. So the laws of Virginia actually were very onerous on anybody that had slaves that wanted to free their slaves in Virginia. And actually, it made it impossible. Jefferson died still with significant debt to his name. Jefferson never legally was allowed to free his slaves. In fact, even if you look at George Washington did many anti-slavery things and actually came out against slavery on many occasions in his writings. And yet, George Washington was not able to free slaves until he died at his deathbed. He could free the slaves. One of the really good evidences we can point to about Jefferson and George Washington being anti-slavery is that every early abolitionist that came out against slavery leading up to the Civil War, even the civil rights leaders, the anti-slavery people of the Civil War, they pointed back to Jefferson and George Washington as being some of the very first abolitionists in America and the leaders of the anti-slavery movement. Frederick Douglass praised Jefferson as laying the foundation upon which slavery was ultimately ended because of the work of Thomas Jefferson.
Hey, Slater Crusaders, our latest special is about canceling our founding fathers. There is such a chasm now between us and our founding fathers, and that is, I believe, the source of why we are so disconnected from even this concept of liberty today. Where is the spirit of liberty? Well, you got to go back to our founding fathers and get it and be inspired by it. When we learn about these men in today's special, it is absolutely incredible. Please watch this special now on the First TV app. You can download it, thefirsttv.com.